Good morning. Thank you for tuning in. It's been a week or two. So I had some oral surgery that I've been healing up from, and that's kind of given me time to think about some things. And as I was healing from having some work in my mouth done, I noticed something about the healing process and about the recovery process. I noticed that I wasn't suffering well. I wasn't doing a good job at suffering. I was suffering, that's for sure, but I wasn't suffering well. And let me explain that, what I mean by that. I wasn't suffering with a Christ-like attitude. I wasn't suffering in a selfless way. I was suffering in a selfish way. The Bible makes it clear that there's more than one way to suffer. You can suffer selflessly, or you can suffer selfishly. You can suffer well, or you can suffer badly. And so I realized that in my time of suffering, I was really struggling to suffer well. I really wanted to make it about me. And the crazy thing is that my suffering in comparison with a lot of other kinds of suffering was relatively minor. The biggest thing, it wasn't even the pain, it was just not being able to eat all the good stuff that I usually eat. A hamburger just doesn't taste the same when it's been put in the blender. And so, the suffering that I was experiencing it was relatively minor. It was nothing, pales in comparison with what a lot of people have to face. And yet, even in my minor moment of suffering, I wasn't doing a very good job at it. And so the point is, I wasn't suffering well. And here's, I was kind of taking an inventory of myself because I was noticing these things. And here's what I noticed. There was a tendency to feel self-pity. I could feel my emotions. I noticed my emotions, pushing me in that direction to feel self-pity. There was an inclination, right? I was leaning towards negative reactions. Sometimes even negative reactions to people reaching out to care for me. I can't explain that, but there was this inclination, to react negatively towards people. And then there was this real temptation, this enticement to want to take my suffering out on the people that were closest to me. And say things like, well, you don't understand, or if you had to deal with this. And so that's what I noticed about myself. And I'm not proud of it. This is not how I had hoped to react. And so this has been a learning process. And I'll just assume that this is something I'm going to have to get better at. I'm new at it. But it was that classic duel that Paul describes between the flesh and the spirit. I did what I didn't want to do, and I didn't do what I wanted to do. I didn't suffer in a Christ-like way. I was wanting to make it about me, and the Spirit was trying to convict me to make it about Jesus. And so even though I had planned to suffer, I knew the day that I was having my surgery, I kind of knew what was in store. Even though I planned to suffer, it quickly became apparent that I hadn't prepared for it. I wasn't ready to do it. And so this sermon, it comes out of a place of weakness in my life, a place that I realize that I need transformation and I need help. And I wanted to share it because of the reality that all of us are going to suffer at some point in our lives. We're all going to suffer. Maybe you're coming out of a season of suffering, whether that is physical or emotional, suffering. Maybe you're just coming out of a season of suffering and you're thinking back and thinking, maybe I could have suffered better, which is kind of what I'm doing right now. Maybe maybe you've had a relatively good run where you haven't dealt with anything heavy, but you're thinking in terms of, the inevitable. At some point, something is going to happen. I'm going to suffer. I want to prepare for that now. And so it's always a good time to talk about this. It's always a good time to think about this, because the reality of suffering is that you can't always predict it. You can't always plan it. You can't always. It's not like having your wisdom teeth pulled. You know when it's going to happen and you know what it's going to feel like. Suffering, for the most part, usually takes us by surprise. It comes and it goes without warning. We can't always predict suffering. We can't know when we're going to experience or why we are experiencing it. But what we can do is we can prepare for it. And so that's what this sermon is about. And so there are two people that I think of when I think of people who can teach us how to suffer well. The first one is obviously Jesus. Jesus is the man of sorrows. He was a man of suffering. He not only experienced suffering, but he knew how to deal with it in a way that he can teach us a better way to suffer. And then the Apostle Paul suffered as well, and he walked in the footsteps of Jesus, and he can also teach us something about suffering. So I want us to start out in Matthew chapter 26. I think a moment in Jesus' life where that suffering manifests itself and becomes very visible to us in this passage. It's Matthew 26, 36 through 46. And of course, it's Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane. It says, Jesus went with his disciples to a place called Gethsemane, and he said to them, "Sit here while I go over there and pray." He took Peter and the two sons of Zebedee along with him, and he began to be sorrowful and troubled. So notice that language there. He was sorrowful and troubled. Then he said to them, "My soul is overwhelmed with sorrow to the point of death. Stay here and keep watch with me." Going a little farther, and in Luke's gospel it says, a stone's throw away, he fell with his face to the ground and prayed, "My Father, if it is possible, may this cup be taken from me, yet not as I will, but as you will." Then he returned to his disciples and found them sleeping. "Couldn't you men keep watch with me for 1 hour?" he asked. "Watch and pray so that you don't fall into temptation. The spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak." He went away a second time and prayed, "My Father, if it is not possible for this cup to be taken away unless I drink it, may your will be done." When he came back, he again found them sleeping because their eyes were heavy. So he left them and went away once more and prayed the third time, saying the same thing. Then he returned to the disciples and said to them, "Are you still sleeping and resting? Look, the hour has come. The Son of Man is delivered into the hands of sinners. Rise, let us go. Here comes my betrayer." So Jesus, in a moment of very real grief, in a moment of very real pain and sorrow, separates himself momentarily from his disciples so that he can pray to God, pour his heart out to God, vocalize his desire to avoid the suffering, but prioritize God's desire to bring him through it. So of course Jesus there is dealing with an immense amount of suffering. The other passage I want us to look at, and we'll draw a few points out of these, is 2 Corinthians chapter 12. This is Paul. Let's read verses 5 through 10. Excuse me. Verses 6 through 10. Even if I should choose to boast, I would not be a fool, because I would be speaking the truth, but I refrain so that no one will think more of me than is warranted by what I do or say, or because of these surpassingly great revelations. Therefore, in order to keep me from becoming conceited, I was given a thorn in my flesh, a messenger of Satan, to torment me. 3 times I pleaded with the Lord to take it away from me, but he said to me, "My grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness. Therefore I will boast all the more gladly about my weaknesses, so that Christ's power may rest on me. That is why, for Christ's sake, I delight in weaknesses, in insults, in hardships, in persecutions, in difficulties. For when I am weak, then I am strong." And so you have Paul, who has been defending his apostleship after being attacked by this group of false teachers and super apostles who had really tried to make him, in the eyes of the Corinthians, look like a fool, look like a nobody. Paul defends himself not by boasting in his strengths, but by boasting in his weaknesses. And part of the suffering that he had experienced was this thorn in the flesh that he pleaded with God 3 times for God to take away. And so both Jesus and Paul know about suffering, and they can teach us Suffering 101. So the first thing I noticed in the passage about Jesus in Gethsemane and dealing with his suffering was that Jesus didn't seek an audience for his suffering. Let me say that again. Jesus didn't seek an audience for his suffering. He sought his Father. He sought God. And there's a couple of things in there that illustrate this. When he's in Gethsemane, he goes with his disciples and he asks for them to stay with him, but then he separates himself from them a little bit. He distances himself from them so that he can pour his heart out to God. Not only that, though, Jesus could have shared his suffering not only with his inner circle of Peter, James, and John. He could have shared his suffering with the 12. He could have shared his suffering with the 70, with the 120 disciples. He could have shared his suffering to multitudes of people. But Jesus didn't seek an audience to express the grief that he was going through. Instead, he sought God. He seeks his Father. He finds a lonely place, and alone he spends some time in prayer. So often, and I noticed this about myself when I was dealing just with recovering from my oral surgery, was that I felt like I needed other people to witness my pain. I wanted other people to see what I was going through, and I wanted to use that as a way to kind of leverage their compassion. And not only that, but sometimes when we suffer, we kind of allow that suffering to make us proud of ourselves. Like, hey, yeah, look at what I can deal with. Look at how tough I am, you know. And sometimes we even kind of get into a bragging rights competition. You know, somebody mentions something that they have dealt with, and we kind of like pull out from our, treasure trove of suffering something that can top theirs. And that mentality that we want an audience, we want people to notice our suffering, really means that we are suffering in a selfish way. And Jesus, in contrast, he suffers selflessly. He seeks God. Not only that, he suffers silently when he's on the cross. He doesn't open his mouth. And so Jesus, Instead of seeking an audience, he seeks God, because think about it. God is the only one who, in light of our suffering, can offer us comfort and peace that surpasses all understanding. You have to ask yourself, what will an audience give me, and what can God give me, and who should I seek in my time of suffering? And so in our preparation for suffering, which is what we're trying to do, we're trying to prepare for the unexpected. We're trying to prepare for those moments that will inevitably come. In our preparation for suffering, we have to learn to pray and seek God rather than seek an audience for pity. Then there's this reality that we'll always have an audience. You're always going to have people witnessing your suffering. Maybe it's your family member, maybe it's your friends, You're always going to have an audience, whether you want one or not. But in order for them to see Christ in you, in your suffering, the one that you need to seek is God first. To find the peace that only He can bring in those moments. The second thing I noticed here was not just what Jesus was doing, but what He was saying. And so Jesus here vocalized His desire in suffering. Let this cup pass from me. If there's any other way. He vocalized His desire in suffering, but He prioritized His Father's desire. And so Jesus prays for two things. The first thing He prays for is a way out, is a way to avoid the inevitable, a way to maybe somehow find a different way to do what God had called Him to do. He says in His first prayer here, if it is possible, may this cup pass from me. If it is not possible for this cup to be taken away, and so Jesus is thinking in terms, and he's telling God, is there some other way that we can do this? And think about that for a second. Jesus feels the confidence to express to His Father how unsettled He is with the thought of this suffering. But He pairs that with something else. He prioritizes His Father's desire. So He vocalizes His desire, but He prioritizes, He places the priority on what God wants from Him. And so He says here, yet not as I will, but as you will. And in His second prayer, may your will be done. And so he prays for God's plan to ultimately prevail. And that's the mentality that we need to adopt. We can say, I'm going to be honest with God about how I feel about this, about the emotions that this is stirring up in me. I'm going to be honest with God about that, and I'm going to tell Him how I feel. But I'm going to accept His plan and His purpose for my life. I'm going to accept what He wants for me. And so I love the freedom that Jesus is teaching us to take advantage of here. He's teaching us that in suffering, we don't have to be silent before God. We can take that to God. We can tell that to God. And so grin and bear it is not the Christian way of suffering. We don't have to just kind of grin while we're going through pain and bear the pain just by gritting our teeth. Jesus prayed to His Father, is there another way to do this? And so it's important to know that God is a loving Father, and we can take these difficult moments of pain before Him. We don't have to hide our pain from God. Paul, in the passage that we read, pleaded with the Lord 3 times You know? Can you imagine that? Lord, please take this from me. No. God, please take this thorn in my flesh from me. No. God, would you please, I don't enjoy this. Would you please take this from me? No. Paul pleaded with the Lord 3 times. And so that confidence is there. That confidence to vocalize his desire and suffering. But then that prioritizing of God's plan and suffering. It reminds me of when I take Tristan to the doctor to get shots. I don't just kind of place him in the room with the doctor and I'll just wait outside. I have him there on my lap. While he is suffering, I want him to feel my arms around him. And I don't tell him not to cry. I don't want him to just kind of try to be a big boy and, not cry. I want him to express the way that he feels. He's usually pretty brave about it, but God is the same way. He wants us to run to him, find that kind of refuge in him, but then he also wants us to tell him how we feel about the suffering that we are going through. But then he wants us to prioritize what he wants for us. Tristan, I think, sometimes gets those shots because he knows that I want him to get them so that he can go to school or whatever. Not so much because he wants to get them. So how do we prioritize what God wants for us? And when it comes to suffering, to be able to do that, it ultimately comes down to not to what we feel about ourselves, but what we believe about God. Is God a good God? Yes. Is God loving? Yes. Does God have a plan and a purpose for us? Yes. If we believe those things, then we can prioritize his will. And the last thing that I quickly want to mention is that Paul saw suffering as an opportunity to grow in grace, to rest in God's grace and to grow in strength. And so, like so many things in life, suffering is a matter of perspective. It's how you see it. And Paul, as he is defending himself against these false apostles who had tried to make him look like a bad, kind of a inferior apostle, Paul boasts in his sufferings, the things that he has had to suffer because he is an apostle. But in order for that suffering not to become pride, and in order for his spirituality and these things, these visions that he has experienced, not to kind of puff him up, he has been sent a thorn in the flesh, a messenger of Satan, some physical suffering so that it would keep him humble. And Paul pleads with God to take that away. God doesn't, because, and God expresses to Paul and says to Paul, because my grace is sufficient for you. My power is perfected in weakness. And so, in other words, Paul has been saying, I need you to take this suffering away. So, sometimes we talk to God like that. We tell him what we think we need. I need you to take this away from me, God. And God says, no, what you need is my grace. What you need is my grace. It would be nice if God took away our suffering. It would be nice if our lives could just be easy. It would be nice if we could just pick flowers and collect seashells and skip around all day. And there are a lot of preachers who peddle that perspective and say that that's what God wants for us. But that's not, that would be nice, but that's not what we need. What we need isn't an easy, carefree life. What we need is a life where God's grace makes suffering bearable. And so resting in God's grace, which is what Paul learned to do, Resting in grace means saying to ourselves and to others, God has got this. Whatever it is that we're going through, God's got this. And that's not an easy thing to say. But when we can do that, when we're resting in His grace and we're saying, God's going to take care of me, He's going to bring me through this one way or another. When we do that, when we kind of let go of our own desire to control our own lives, something mysterious happens. A paradox takes place. That's when we become strong. In our weakest moments in suffering, when we have allowed God's grace to be the thing that we're going to rest in, that's when suddenly we can deal with anything. We can go through anything. When, like Paul says later on, when I am weak, then I am strong. And so the strongest people aren't the ones who live pain-free lives or suffering lives free from suffering, but they're the ones whose suffering-filled lives have freed them up to place all their trust in God. And so you think about people like Dietrich Bonhoeffer, Martin Luther King Jr., Mother Teresa, people who suffered well because they had said, God has got this. Anybody mentioned in Hebrews 11 had learned to rest in God's grace, and they grew in God's strength so that they could deal with anything. And so we can't always plan for suffering, but we can prepare for it. And so let's seek God now. Let's prioritize God's plan now. Let's learn to see suffering as an opportunity now, so that when the day of suffering inevitably comes, Jesus can be seen in us. Blessings.